I see some familiar faces in the room, but for those of you I haven't had a chance to meet yet, my name is Reitmann. I am a research fellow at the Vienna Center for Disarmament and Non-Proliferation. And today I'm excited to present a new resource that we've developed for you, for diplomats working on space security, for your colleagues in Capital, a tool that I hope you will find useful for getting a clear picture of norms of behavior in space, for getting a better overview of where other countries stand, and for developing statements, working papers, concrete proposals for the OEWG on PAROS. It's called the Space Norms Atlas. And just like an atlas, it maps states' proposals for norms and standards to ensure peace and stability in space. I'll say more about what you can find in this publication, the data behind it, how you can use it, and the lessons and recommendations that we draw from it. And we'll also have an opportunity to discuss current trends in space security and to look ahead at the July session of the OEWG with our special guests, Clive Hughes and Sabrina Alam. And of course, we'll have time to answer questions from you. But before that, I want to express my sincere thanks to the UK Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office for sponsoring our work. We could not support delegations in their challenging task through resources like the Space Norms Atlas and others that we've provided, through workshops and dialogue without this generous backing from the UK. And so it gives me great pleasure to welcome Ambassador David Riley, the UK's permanent representative to the Conference on Disarmament. To start us off, please, Ambassador.
Thank you, Louis, and good afternoon, colleagues. It's an interesting test for you today, because normally you come for the food and stay for the conversation, but today you must come for the conversation and stay for the food. So please do earn your lunch. It will be worth it, I can assure you. I want to say thank you to VCDNP for bringing together today's event, for the Atlas, but also for the very strong partnership that we have built between the FCDO and the VCDNP, more broadly, but in particular on space. And as many of you who know Lou will understand, at the heart of this relationship is the sort of the energy and the commitment and the passion that Louis himself brings to this. So I wanted to sort of take this moment to thank Louis and to recognise all of the incredible work that he is doing. Much of what we discussed today in terms of the context in which we're operating, you will all understand, and we talk about these issues frequently here in Geneva. As our reliance on outer space increases, whether that's for our economies, whether it is for civil resilience, whether it is for our national security, so too do the risks of escalation. Now, the pathways to escalation are not inevitable, but they are becoming increasingly acute, whether that is misinterpreted interference with communication satellites or other capabilities, whether it is threats to critical satellites, whether it is debris generating activities, whether it is the much debated ambiguity around dual use capabilities. So more than ever, we need to respond drawing on the broad range of tools and levers and activities that are going to help reduce the risk of miscalculation and of escalation. Now, those of you who've been involved in PAROS for longer than me, and I see a number of you in the room who've been doing this for years, you will know that we have no shortage of ideas out there. They have been discussed through OEWGs, through GGEs, in the Conference on Disarmament and elsewhere. But they have become dispersed through different fora, through different statements, through different outcome documents. And regrettably, I believe personally, increasingly represented as being in opposition to each other. And that's particularly true of the debate between legally binding and non-legally binding instruments. And this is where the Space Atlas comes in. It is, for the first time, we believe, a systematic mapping of over a decade of state practice and proposals. It brings together norms discussed across the PAROS process. It considers areas of convergence and divergence, and it considers gaps where further dialogue might be needed. In doing so, I hope, that it moves our debate from abstract principles to quite concrete proposals. And as Louis said in his opening remarks, this is particularly valuable in the context of the OEWG on PAROS and all its aspects, where when we meet again in July, now engaging on substance, we hope that we will begin to take some of the theory and the principle that we discussed in previous OEWGs and GGEs and begin to turn that into practical ideas that can support greater security, safety and sustainability in outer space. Another, I think, value, another advantage of this atlas is that it helps support capacity building as well for smaller countries, smaller delegations, those who are new to the debates we are having here in Geneva, in New York and in Vienna. It doesn't provide the answers, nor do I think it pretends to do so. And if it were that easy, we probably wouldn't be here today having this conversation. But it does provide an incredibly valuable basis on which to strengthen dialogue between states, but also between states and the increasingly diverse private sector and civil society who are so fundamental to what we are doing in outer space. So thank you again to all of you for joining us today. Thank you to VCDNP for bringing the event together, for the Atlas, and for the partnership that we continue to value greatly. Thank you, Louis.
And what you said really resonated, I think, with the content of the Space Norms Atlas, and it was a really good summary of what we're trying to bring to delegations. Now, to give everybody a better impression of what the Space Norms Atlas is about, we have produced a short video, which I would like to share with you now, and you can watch it on the screens up above.
Space is special. Humans are united by our fascination with the skies. Space triggers our imagination, our desire to explore. We're deeply connected to it. Today, more than ever, space powers our societies, our economies. But space is also ordinary. Like in any sphere of human activity, there's friction and there's competition. What we need are norms and rules to manage them. We have to keep space secure for the critical infrastructure of our modern world. We cannot afford conflict in space. Governments must adopt new standards on how space objects interact, how we communicate and de-escalate, and how we use space for defense to ensure order and predictability. We've developed a new resource that supports governments on that mission, the Space Norms Atlas. It's the first map of emerging standards for ensuring stability and preventing escalation in space. We've studied the last 13 years of UN processes on space security, collecting over 1,200 data points. The Atlas identifies more than 150 norms that governments have suggested on non-interference, transparency, communication, and on other issues. The Atlas also measures which of these proposed norms enjoy the broadest international support. The Atlas provides clarity about what's on the table, what we mean when we talk about norms of behavior in space. And the data is comprehensive. It includes the views of all countries involved. It also points the way ahead. Governments can use this resource to propose concrete measures and instruments to regulate behavior in space. But above all, the Atlas shows that new norms are emerging. That's not a question of preference or approach. The data is clear. Dialogue has produced shared ideas of how we must behave to keep space secure. Now, these shared ideas must be forged into concrete rules. And the Space Norms Atlas can help governments get there.
Like the handsome chap in the video was saying, the Space Norms Atlas is the first comprehensive overview of emerging norms for space security. And I want to start into it by telling you why we made it. Ambassador Riley already alluded to this. A norms-based approach has always been about states deciding collectively what behaviors we want to encourage or deter. And so naturally, proposals for norms of behavior have been made by a variety of states, but also experts in different working papers, statements, and so on, across years of UN meetings. And that's great, that's what we want to see, but it also makes it more difficult to keep track of the conversation, of all the suggestions that have been made, and to understand which proposed norms are supported by a broader majority of states. The Space Norms Atlas addresses this problem by mapping 150 norms of behavior from PAROS processes since 2012. In my consultations with many of you, you were surprised at the volume of ideas that have been put forward, and so was I. Frankly, I didn't expect there to be 150 ideas, but I think this is fundamentally great news because it shows us that PAROS processes have produced shared understanding of what behaviors are desirable and which behaviors are unacceptable, and that gives us something to work with. And I also want to highlight that our data set is inclusive. We've analyzed all submissions from all countries and other participants in PAROS processes available on the UN websites. And so you will find suggestions from all different types of perspectives on PAROS in this publication. Now, let me guide you a little bit through how you can use the Space Norms Atlas. It has two parts. We start with this visual overview across 4 pages that you can also see in front of you. And that really contains all the norms that we have identified, divided into 9 categories. I think that this part of the Atlas could even serve as a quick reference point as you're sitting in the OEWG sessions. I hope it is a practical overview for you. And this overview also shows which proposed norms are widely supported. Now, we've determined that widely supported means supported by at least 10 states and other participants in PAROS processes. I'll say more about that in a minute. The ones that meet this criterion are highlighted in color, and the bracketed numbers behind them show you in how many consensus documents a norm was adopted. And it was important for us to indicate support and adoption in a consensus outcome separately, because states typically decide to give or withhold support for an outcome based on its entirety, based on the whole document. And so we felt it would be imprecise to say that states support a specific norm only because it appears in a consensus outcome. And we see in the data set many cases where a norm was adopted in an outcome document, but other than that, we actually see very few countries referencing it, repeating it, supporting it and vice versa. We have several norms in the data set that are supported by many different states, but they have not yet appeared in a consensus outcome. So it was important for us to measure both and to give you both pieces of information. You'll also notice that some norms are marked with an asterisk. Now, these are norms that states talk about a lot and with a lot of consistency in language. They're mostly repetitions of articles in the UN Charter and the Outer Space Treaty, often verbatim repetitions. And so, because of the absence of discussion on these norms, because they seem firmly established, we did not collect further data on these, instead focusing on norms that are still more emerging, where there still is a lot of discussion, but where states did interpret existing legal provisions. Due regard under Article 9 of the Outer Space Treaty is a great example. We, of course, looked at that very closely, and you will find that in the Space Norms Atlas. Now, let me show you how we determined this threshold of 10 states and other participants to signify strong support. The graph shows the distribution of support across the data set. So how many norms are supported by one participant, how many norms are supported by two participants, and so on. And on the left, you can see that the vast majority of proposed norms have very few supporters. Now, that doesn't mean that they're not good proposals, and it doesn't mean that they don't address important issues. To the contrary, actually, and I'll share some examples with you later, I hope that one of the effects of the Space Norms Atlas will be that suggestions that were made only once in a working paper that perhaps not all that many people read are resurfacing and picked up again and more closely examined for their value. And then we can see that the distribution drops quite consistently to pick up again at between 10 and 17. So it creates another small hump in the chart there. And these are the proposed norms we identify as having strong support. And you can even see a couple of outliers on the very right-hand side of the graph, a handful of norms that have very strong support between 20 and 24. What you can see here is the level of norm creation in the different categories that we've set up. So I'll caveat this just by saying that sorting norms into categories is not an exact science. Some of the norms that we found could easily be housed in several categories, but this still illustrates very nicely on which issues states have generated the most output, the most ideas. And I think that there's an interesting learning from this data. We know that a few states criticize that PAROS processes supposedly focus too much on what may be complementary issues, maybe issues that are handled mostly in copulous, like debris creation, debris mitigation. But this data suggests that we perhaps don't need to be concerned about that, because about 75%, you can see the darker colors there, 75% of proposed norms focus on clear-cut security issues, non-interference with other space systems, restraint in military activities in space, complying with IHL, and transparency to reduce the risk of escalation. And of course, complementarity is key, so it's important that delegates are not prevented from looking at space security from all angles. But in any case, this data shows us that PAROS processes are not at a risk of losing focus on the core of their mandate. The second part of the publication has detailed analyses of everything that has been said on each norm. We go category by category, and you'll find again an overview of norms in that category at the top of each section, showing you also in which consensus outcomes certain norms were adopted. And I hope that these sections in particular will be helpful to you as you develop your inputs into the OEWG. We pull out quotes, we pull out verbatim language that states have used to describe certain norms, and I know that this is really important for diplomatic work. I'd like to now pull out a few of the proposed norms to show you the types of insights you can expect to find in these sections. And I'll share 2 examples of how the Space Norms Atlas can help states flesh out and operationalize norms of behavior. On non-interference, the 2024 GGE report captures the norm that states do not disrupt space systems where there's a high risk of misunderstanding and escalation. In the dataset, we found proposals for more specific norms to define more closely what those space systems could be. And so, if I may suggest to you, as a concrete outcome, states could commit to not interfere with the targets you see listed there. And just to explain very briefly, interference with optical or infrared sensors for Earth observation could be seen as a sign that preparations for an attack are underway if they prevent others from capturing satellite imagery over certain areas. Non-interference with strategic space objects there refers to command and control for both nuclear and conventional forces, for early warning satellites that observe missile silos and make them an integral part of deterrence. But states also identify space objects supporting the safety of nuclear power plants or reservoirs and dams that deserve special protection from interference to prevent major catastrophes. And another example is there is broad agreement among states that states should share information on their space security strategies and on counter-space capabilities. We see that referenced a lot. You've heard it plenty of times. The Space Norms Atlas specifies what states expect to be a part of this norm. So, besides strategies, there are calls for states to publish doctrines, which contain more detail on how they expect to assess and react in certain situations, but also to report on counter-space capabilities existing and under development, as well as annual expenditure on military activities in space. And states are asked to explain in their strategies how their capabilities and activities in space match their stated objective, because this allows states to compare stated objectives and intentions in strategies against actual observable behavior. And finally, there are important lessons to learn from this large data set. I will only focus on 4, but you can find more of them in the publication. I know that it is still a widely held perception that PAROS is dominated by disagreement between legally binding instruments versus norms. And that's why I think it's so important to emphasize what is clear from this data, from the 150 proposed norms we've identified, from the convergence that we can measure. Norms on space security are emerging. Whether states agree to pursue this unanimously or not. And in a way, this shouldn't surprise us, because multilateral dialogue and norm building belong together. It is just what happens when states agree, when states discuss their ideas and their concerns. And seeing as states have already come a long way, I think it really is time for concrete outcomes. And so states can use the Space Norms Atlas to develop proposals for commitments, for instruments to be adopted, whether that be through the OEWG, through joint statements in coalitions of the willing, through declarations at senior government level, or even through the UN General Assembly. Each section in the Space Norms Atlas identifies opportunities for concrete outcomes, and I was just talking about 2 examples for that. Secondly, based on the data that we examined, only 16 states have made a contribution in more than one PAROS process. And among those are only 6 developing countries. We know that this is because most previous processes were not open to all states. But it's clear that we cannot make rules and norms for space through conversations between 16 countries alone. We also know that the July session of the OEWG will be a litmus test. There are several countries that are thinking about getting more involved, and they're watching closely. They need assurance that states' discussions will yield meaningful results. So it's very important that preparations for the July session are taken and that we endeavor to the best of our abilities to maintain the focus on substantive issues and discuss concrete ideas. But states can also invest in capacity building and outreach to those newcomer countries to support them, to help them in developing policies on space security that meet their development and security interests. Thirdly, the visual overview at the start of the Space Norms Atlas shows that norm creation has been uneven. There are fewer norms on non-interference and restraint that have gained significant support among states and that have been adopted in consensus outcomes. And it was particularly noticeable in the data set that proposals around IHL compliance in space were mostly driven by the ICRC and civil society. So while there has been a lot more ideas proposed on these issues, we have seen a lot less convergence around them. States need to address this. We need more norms on non-interference and on restraint that are widely supported. And finally, states would benefit from more data. I think that the Space Norms Atlas illustrates very nicely how useful data-driven insights can be and that they can sometimes unearth unexpected findings. A common complaint is that TCBM implementation remains low, but states actually don't have very good information on the status of implementation in different countries around the world. So making data, making case studies available could incentivize states to match good practices demonstrated by their peers. But states would also benefit from better information on existing laws, regulations, and guidelines because there are already some solutions out there for space security issues. And one practice that states could adopt in the OEWG is to endorse existing standards to become international standards. For example, Japan's national guidelines on RPOs that have attracted a lot of positive attention. I will stop here and will say thank you very much for your attention. And I would now like to invite a few participants in the audience who have received the Space Norms Atlas as a preview to share their personal reflections on how delegations might benefit from this resource.
I'm going to be very brief. I really wish to recognize the quiet but solid architecture created by the VCDNP, and I believe it's an architect that builds the foundation for translating ideas into effective policies and ensuring, in my view, a smooth path towards security and disarmament. And this document, really very valuable, brings, in my view, not only information and ideas, but most importantly, inspiration. And it offers a valuable manual and a guide that certainly will enrich our multilateral conversations with very, very important and essential ingredients. Thank you. Thank you, Luis. Thank you.
The Space Norms Atlas is an extremely valuable resource for all of us working in space security, but I find it particularly useful in my role as a diplomat from a developing country. I also want to just state up front that these remarks are in my personal capacity and it does not reflect the views of my country. As we have heard, the Atlas brings together more than 150 proposed norms from over a decade of UN discussions, which provides a clear picture of where international support is converging across issues like non-interference, debris mitigation, transparency, and communication. This consolidated overview is especially helpful for delegations with limited technical capacity. Secondly, the Atlas highlights norms that directly protects critical civilian services that developing countries rely on, such as weather forecasting, disaster response, and communications, by addressing harmful interference and debris-creating activities as well. This is important for countries like mine, where space-based services play an essential developmental and humanitarian role. Additionally, the Atlas emphasizes the importance of strengthening capacity of developing countries to participate meaningfully in space activities and verification, and provides a basis to argue for more inclusive, equitable space governance and to ensure that emerging norms do not marginalize smaller space actors. Hopefully, as you've indicated in your presentation, that the Atlas will increase the number of participating countries from the developing world. Finally, the Atlas reinforces core principles such as the use of space for the benefit and in the interest of all countries, regardless of their degree of development. This aligns closely with the priorities of many of us here in Geneva, ensuring that space remains a peaceful, cooperative domain that supports sustainable development. Importantly, it also documents emerging norms and areas of convergence, which can help build momentum towards a legally binding instrument. It also identifies behaviors that raise risks of escalation, reinforcing the urgency of a legally binding instrument on the prohibition of the weaponization of space. In short, the Atlas equips many of us here with the clarity, data, and confidence needed to engage constructively in the upcoming session of the OEWG on space that will be taking place in July this year. And it will assist definitely towards shaping a safer, more inclusive space environment. Thank you for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Louis, and also Ambassador Riley for the excellent and very insightful presentation and remarks. I personally find the Atlas extremely valuable from the practitioner's perspective. One of the main challenges that we often face in PAROS discussion is that the ideas on norms are scattered across different statements and processes. So what the Atlas does very well is to bring together this into a more structured and accessible overview. In that sense, it's a very practical tool for us as diplomats, and it helps us also very quickly to see where there is already some level of convergence, and also where discussions could realistically move forward. At the same time, it's also makes us it much easier for us to identify also where gaps or divergence still exist, which is often where our efforts needs to be focused more in the upcoming session of the Open Working Group in July. And beyond that, it also serves as a very useful reference point for a delegation, especially for a small missions in preparing for discussion in the upcoming session of Open-Ended Working Group. If I may add one perspective, I'm building on the discussion, previous discussion on the Global South with VCDNP and GCSP. I think there is one additional dimension that could be further strengthened, particularly from the perspective of equatorial countries. There are around 13 equatorial countries across South America, Africa, and Asia Pacific, including Indonesia, that are located beneath the orbital path, which more frequently used by the satellites. And as a result, these countries tend to be more exposed to risks, especially from the falling space debris. In our case, in Indonesia's case, we have experienced several incidents of falling debris over the years, despite not being a major launching state. So this suggests that the distribution of risk is not always aligned with the distribution of capabilities. So, and if I may also add one point in the context of PAROS, the debris is often discussed in the context of safety and sustainability, but it is also important to recognize that the debris can result not only from accidental incidents, but it also from security-related activities in outer space, including the testing or use of counter-space capabilities. In that sense, debris is not only a peaceful uses issue, but also directly linked to a strategic stability and the prevention of arms race in outer space. So, in conclusion, while the Atlas already captures the important norms on the debris mitigation, the cooperation and responsibility, perhaps it may be also useful for going forward to further reflect the dimension of uneven exposure to risks, including how geographically vulnerable countries perceive these evolving threats, as well as international cooperation measures to mitigate them. So I hope that this could help enrich our discussion, further discussion, particularly as we move forward toward a more substantive exchange in the upcoming session, not only on security, but also on safety and sustainability. Overall, I believe that the Atlas is very timely and practical contribution, and I'm sure that it will be very useful for delegation in the months ahead. Thank you.
Well, Clive, Sabrina, welcome. Thank you so much for traveling to Geneva to be with us today. We will have the next half hour to apply some of the findings from the Space Norms Atlas to the current moment, and to look ahead at the July session of the OAWG and get us all thinking about what to expect and how to prepare. And we'll explore how the threat landscape in space is changing and what that means for the work here in Geneva. Allow me to just introduce our speakers. Clive Hughes is Head of Space Security and Advanced Threats at the UK FCDO, and he's very well known to all of you. And Sabrina Alam is an expert in space regulation and sustainability, and she's a rare combination of being both remarkably young and remarkably experienced. A theoretical physicist by training, she has worked as a researcher for NASA and ESA, and as head of space sustainability for SES, one of the biggest satellite operators in the world. She has advised governments and corporates on space sustainability at BDO and KPMG, and most recently founded her own advisory business, Matter Space and Defense, and was appointed space lead at the Technology Transfer Office of the University of Luxembourg. Congratulations. Now, I want to start with a question to the both of you, because you look at space from different perspectives, right? We have a government official, a diplomat who looks at space security from one perspective, and we have somebody who's more familiar with the industry context, with the sustainability context, looking at these issues as well. So I'm curious about the major developments that you both see affecting security in space, and I would love if you could give us a quick overview, each of you. Clive, please.
Yeah, thank you, Louis. Thank you for inviting me to take part in this panel, and thanks everybody for coming as well. So before I sort of talk about what developments are affecting space security, I want to mention one thing which really hasn't changed and hasn't changed for a long time, which is that space is really a very strategic domain. Space systems are very strategic. They are the eyes and ears of countries on the world, gives you global reach, and are involved in kind of nuclear deterrence and so on. So this hasn't really changed over a long time, and so any developments we talk about are kind of the flesh on the bones of this fundamental fact, I think. And that fact shapes, I guess, the developments. I think, I mean, I'll just mention a few things. Obviously, the geopolitical situation is tense at the moment, and that is one of the drivers of everything we see happening in space. And I think, you know, the sort of things we're seeing happening in space are the growth in counter space capabilities, the use of space capabilities for military purposes. On the more positive side, we've also got the development of capabilities that could help us with norms, such as space domain awareness, increasing capabilities there. So it's not just a negative on capability development, there are positives as well. And then kind of overlaid on that, you've got the sort of the kind of big commercial push to sort of develop operations in space, which is driving a massive increase in the density of space objects. And we're seeing a lot of space objects or space systems increasingly used, having a dual-use purpose. So in the past, where we might have expected communication satellites to be few and far between, located in stationary orbit, now we have thousands of communication satellites, both governmental and non-governmental, all operating and interchangeable. So that's made the situation incredibly more complex, and even just in the last few years that has happened. The very number of space objects itself just changes the strategic calculation in space, because any activity that you choose to conduct in space now potentially has significantly wider ramifications than it might have in the past. And so just the growth in the number is something we need to take account of in security, space security conversations. And I think one of the many interesting things about this report, but just to focus on one, is it really demonstrates how the situation in space has really changed, because it kind of illustrates that there are so many different concerns now that states have when it comes to space, and so many different solutions that have proliferated compared to if you look back. So it's a really good illustration of how things have changed. Let me leave it at that and hand over.
Well, thank you. You stole all my points now, so difficult to follow that. No, well, firstly, thank you, Louis, for all of you for coming and attending. And, you know, I really want to summarize this in 4 points, even though actually we could probably talk about this topic for weeks on end. Well, firstly, why is space playing a bigger role within the security landscape? Well, one, space is no longer an isolated domain. It actually touches every critical infrastructure that we see, from finance to energy to communications, navigation, and so on. So actually, it's becoming the core of how society is functioning at the current moment. So everyone who has a phone with them right now, without space capabilities, we wouldn't be able to actually be holding them and use them. So again, playing a vital role in the way governments and the way industry go about daily operations. Secondly, this term dual use. So we've seen a rapid rise and growth in dual use capabilities. And I'll go into that a little bit later about, well, what does dual use actually mean and why is it existing right now? And should we separate commercial activities from military operations? Well, actually, dual use is being driven by governments, and given the geopolitical context at the moment, we are seeing that the lines between civil and defense are blurred. So this is a rapid trend that we're actually noticing right now across the space and defense domains too. Thirdly, space congestion is actually leading to ambiguity in orbit. So distinguishing normal operations and behavior from harmful, potentially harmful operations is getting harder to do. And this is creating quite a few issues where we are having, and we'll talk about it a bit later on the sustainability lens, but we are having issues from the commercial industry, where we're saying, well, what do we need to do to enhance that? Now we need to ramp up our spendings, our technology, but who's going to pay for this as well? So it's moving away from commercial models into actually political models that we're seeing within the landscape. And that fourth one, and actually the gentleman earlier touched on it really well, which is that security is dependent now on resiliency and sustainability. So it's not just about protecting assets anymore, but it's about designing systems with what we call resilient logic and a life cycle way of thinking from now on that incorporates this kind of forward-looking, holistic perspective into space operations, space technology. And that feeds into the conversation about sovereignty, which is, I would say, not necessarily a fifth trend, because that kind of encapsulates all four. But the idea is that if nations are to be sovereign, what does that mean? And the space industry is, by design, something where our value chain touches every single nation, almost, from design to operations to in-orbit to decommissioning. So these are the four major trends that we're seeing at the moment. And again, happy to, throughout the discussion, go into a bit more depth on those. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think you've opened up kind of a potpourri of different issues that indeed we could be discussing for a long time. But I want us to first look a little bit more closely at the July session, because I think increasingly it will be what is on our minds. So Clive, if I can come back to you. For July, we really see some of the biggest space security issues on the agenda. We have destructive testing, protecting critical civilian infrastructure, uncoordinated RPOs. These are some of the biggest topics we've talked about, and the Space Norms Atlas also reflects this. Norms that address these threats are some of the most widely supported. So how do we make sure that we achieve meaningful conclusions on these big issues from the session? Big question.
Yeah, that's a really difficult question, because I think what you're asking me to do is how do we overcome some very strong differences of opinion on how to sort of address these issues. And obviously I'm on one side of the debate, but I guess I also see the UK and myself as being on the kind of side of, you know, trying to achieve international peace and security and pragmatism and practical ways forward. And I think we really need to try and find those issues where we have a really true shared interest in making progress. And I think despite the geopolitical differences, you know, where can we make progress despite the differences? And you know, perhaps one of those areas which is coming up at the July meeting is one you already referred to, which is the intentional destruction or destructive testing in space, because already there is a moratorium supported by a number of countries on destructive testing of direct descent anti-satellite missiles. Now, the last sort of such test, significant test, was in 2021. And at that time, I think there were about, say, 3,000 active satellites in orbit. So today, we're 14,000 plus, something like that, in just a very short period of time. And so conducting such a test now would have significantly larger ramifications. And so it's just and this year, perhaps we'll have another 4,000 satellites placed in orbit if the trends are anything to go by. So by the end of, once the July session and November sessions are finished and we've got through the first committee, we might be reaching about 20,000 satellites in orbit. And so the consequences of that kind of activity are only going to get worse and exponentially worse over time. And it seems to me that that should be an area where we should be able to, with good will, to find some kind of common cause, irrespective of the geopolitical difficulties. So finding those types of issues. I think perhaps one or two other points is that I think obviously we do have very different perspectives, or there are different perceptions around what is the threat, the main threats that we face in space. Obviously that's shaped by your national perspective. So I think when it comes to writing reports and drafting UN reports, I think it's important to sort of acknowledge the different perspectives and capture those and capture them sort of accurately and record them clearly in the documents. And we often try to sort of draft our way around the differences, but that's just kind of sweeping it under the carpet maybe, and maybe it might be better to kind of have those differences clear so that we can come back to them as the context constantly shifts and as opportunities arise to kind of revisit things. So there's like I guess a process issue. And yeah, I'll leave it at that for now and hand it back over.
Thank you, Clive. You made some very important comments there about destructive testing and indeed sort of what that means for the significance of space for national security, defense, for military activities. So I want to build on that and connect it to what Sabrina had already touched on with those increasing dual-use capabilities. Because I feel that the conversations on PAROS and space defense, on what you mentioned, sovereignty, resilience, and space, are quite disconnected, even though they're very much important for each other. So observing the trend towards more defense capabilities in space, towards more dual use, what consideration is given to risk reduction and de-escalation?
Yeah, well, thank you. A big question. Firstly, I want to take us back to, well, why is dual use becoming a thing? Why are we now blending commercial, civil infrastructure into defense and military capabilities? Now, actually, traditional space, what we call it, there was a clear distinction. So military and governments usually drove certain projects and technologies, and then commercial applications came from that. And there were two kind of separate, I would say, technological operations going on, managed by different organizations. What we're seeing now is that with the rapid pace of potential war, with the geopolitical instability that we're seeing, they are blending into one, because actually space is not the final frontier, as a lot of people say, but it's actually the first line of defense. I mentioned earlier, space is touching critical infrastructure. So actually, when we talk about defense capabilities, we're talking about disrupting civil society. Now, why, again, is this the case of dual use? So firstly, commercial companies cannot rely on the prospect of war and become a pure military organization. It's just not able to do that within the space domain. So to raise capital, to actually be operational, they expect funding and based on their commercial activities. So we're looking at space from a Earth observation lens, telecommunication lens, navigation lens, and we're seeing that through Google Maps. We're seeing that through, actually looking at, well, how do we assist the climate change discussion using space data, space imagery? Well, at the same time, those technologies are also able to be applicable within the defense landscape. So now we're seeing all of a sudden there's a potential for harmful activities to take place on the ground. So in order for governments to rapidly defend or be prepared, rather than saying we're now going to spend 5 years creating a new product that's just for a military purpose, what they turn to is the industry and say, hold on, we actually need you to very quickly use your technology and provide us imagery of what's happening on the ground. So almost switching that commercial lens to actually a defense lens, providing information to nations and states and saying, well, this is what we're observing, this is the, the analysis of what we're seeing on the ground. So we're seeing movement of military personnel. We're seeing movement of, actually or reduction of crops and so on. And that's causing or leading to a prospect of war, essentially. And so this is why they've blended into one. There's no time for military operations to take place in isolation. There's also no commercial viability for military applications to take place separately as well. This is why there's a blend of dual use. This is also driven by governments, because now what we're seeing is that in order to get funding from public institutions, the call for funding always states now dual use applications. So we're seeing a greater increase of public-private partnerships because industry and governments are coming together and actually designing systems that can essentially do both. And so this is one of the big drivers around this dual-use conversation. And how that then mitigates risk, well, firstly, the fact that everyone's coming together from the very beginning and the design phase is good, because it means that the priorities are clear. We're not sitting necessarily in isolation now, where industry are off doing their own thing, military are off, or government, are off doing their own thing, policymakers doing their own thing. Everyone's coming together and saying, well, how can we advance our capabilities as a state or within this concept of sovereignty? What we are not seeing enough of, though, is increased communication. So actually addressing some of the points that you've made within the Atlas. And we're not seeing enough of how essential PAROS is within these discussions. And the reason why is because, again, it's driven by, well, what do we need? What do we need? How can we defend? How can we defend? But actually what we're not doing is thinking on the long-term futuristic perspective of space and within our defense landscape. So in order to drive that discussion forward, and we'll go to it in the next part, we're seeing this concept of resiliency coming out. Well, rather than actually creating something that is going to be used within the next 2 years, we need something and a technology that's going to be used within 10 years that can switch between commercial and military, that also makes a distinction between the uses and who operates in the security layers. But at the same time, we need that now incorporation of actually, well, what are the norms that we need to adhere to, and how can we together actually have these discussions in the same room as we're doing today. It's getting there, but we are, I would say, the more and more work we do within the space and defense landscape, and giving my honest opinion, the more it seems like everyone's moving into their own corner and doing these operations and funding and so on by themselves. And we need that platform, and this Atlas is actually a great way to do that, to say, let's bring this conversation together, because this is for the benefit of everyone in the room. And this is how we do dual use right. So I hope I answered some of that question, but just to give you the perspective from a real industry lens.
Thank you, Sabrina. I think it was especially important for everybody here in the room to hear, because we talk a lot about dual-use capabilities, but to have a better understanding of where that's coming from, where is the pressure in that direction coming from, what are the motivators, what are the drivers of this, and I take away from your answer that increasing the conversation on risk reduction, how do we prevent a buildup of capabilities in space from leading to escalation, is absolutely critical, because it's so urgent and because these developments are happening so quickly. Clive, I want to get your reflections on this and ask you what you think the implications of this trend towards dual use are. How do you think this affects the work here in Geneva?
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, the dual-use challenge has been with us for a long time in space, and I remember back in 2023 in the open-ended working group on responsible space behaviours, very fraught, difficult discussion on how to define dual use challenge, and that was just within the UK delegation and didn't even see the light of day in the room. But I think there's so many dimensions to it. So you could be talking about the use of objects for civilian purposes or military purposes, or whether the object itself is run by the military or run by a commercial operator. Then another way to look at it is from a kind of strategic, tactical use perspective. So some systems are very kind of strategic, nuclear related, but also being used for kind of conventional or tactical purposes. And so that's a kind of an aspect of the dual use question. And even within, you can sort of look at it from a kind of, is an object being used for a malign purpose or a benign purpose, and how do you define malign and benign? Because even if the object is military or civilian, you could still use either one for a malign or a benign purpose. So it's a really kind of tricky concept to kind of get at. But I think, with this challenge, I think we see existing dual-use challenges becoming more complex and more worse, existing ones getting worse, and new ones coming in as well. So in terms of the existing problems, so we've always had satellite communications systems. Going back a few decades, these were sort of big satellites, predominantly based in geostationary orbit, probably the military ones distinct from the ones that are being used for commercial purposes. But now, satellite communications satellites, there are thousands of them. They've gone from dozens to thousands and upon thousands of them in different orbits being used across different purposes, both military and civilian, and in conflict and outside of conflict. And so trying to bring some kind of rules or norms to govern all this is inherently more challenging than it might have been in the past. You can say the same for Earth observation satellites. Again, they were very few and far between a decade ago and had certain capabilities, but now commercial Earth observation capabilities are incredibly sophisticated and advanced and provide now militarily useful information. And so we see that being bought or used in conflicts or for military purposes. So if you've got a lot, thousands of satellites involved in communications, and they're involved in conflict, and they become a possible target for that, then it's a lot more difficult for states to make those assessments about what to do in those situations, and whether to target them, or even then whether to use those objects at all in that situation. So the escalation risks are sort of greater now, just because of that situation. And then, in terms of the new dual-use challenges that have come on into play, so we've got novel applications like in-orbit servicing and manufacturing, or active debris removal, which we didn't used to see in the past, even in the recent past. So these are novel activities. These are capabilities which can remove objects from space. But obviously, it can also be used to attack or interfere with other objects. And the capabilities that you need to be able to carry out those kinds of activities are also the kinds that are useful for conducting rendezvous and proximity operations to kind of assess and characterize other countries' satellites if you need to do that. So these novel applications are also bringing dual-use challenges with them in addition to the sort of traditional dual-use challenges that we've had. So I think, for me, what it really re-emphasizes is the importance of you know, at the OEWG, really having a focus on what we can do to reduce the risks of miscalculation and unintended escalation, because these capabilities exist, they're being developed rapidly. That's difficult to put that back in the box, and so we have to work with the world as it is and try and find ways to reduce the risk of escalation. And again, I mean, we have very, I guess, nascent understanding of how international humanitarian law, UN Charter apply to space, because we haven't really seen conflict in space up until now, and so it's only just an emerging phenomenon. So there are big challenges there as well. So yeah, that's kind of what I see as the implications for these developments in dual-use capabilities.
Thank you, Clive. The challenge is growing bigger and bigger, is what I'm hearing. But I also note that if we talk about sort of baseline things that we can agree on in terms of risk reduction, there's some really good examples in the Space Norms Atlas. I mentioned some earlier about non-interference with objects that really pose the most severe risk of misunderstanding and escalation. So I think there are ideas out there and things that we can work with. I will open the floor for the Q&A in just a few minutes, so please have a think about any questions you'd like to ask about the publication or to Clive and Sabrina. But I just want to ask Sabrina a final question. When we talk about creating rules, norms in space, it's important that they complement the wealth of existing laws and regulations and guidelines. And I know that has been a big push towards space sustainability. How, from your perspective, does that link to security? And are there any solutions for sustainability issues that can also help us solve some of the big security issues?
Yeah, well, thank you. And one of the things I wanted to mention is that security and sustainability are often discussed as two separate things. But actually now what we're seeing is that they're interdependent. And what we mean by that is everything from the debris creation side, and actually I think you're nodding your head there because you made earlier we had some really good points about what debris creation could do and what it could essentially, or the impact it could have on developing nations, and how it could also be potentially harmful or used as a defense mechanism. But also lack of coordination. All of these affect trust. They affect predictability within the space environment, which essentially then affect our critical services and infrastructure. So that then raises the risk for our systems, essentially. And you've got space traffic management as a solution. You've got, honestly, the technology is developing at such a rapid pace. We are seeing a bit of a disconnect between how technology is advancing and then how policy making can catch up to that, which is also part of where the risk is coming from. I mean, who's going to be in charge of this? Who is going to be enforcing this, particularly within the industry where it's so global and vast? But what we're seeing is that actually one of the biggest risks is that it's harder, and I touched on it earlier, to distinguish routine behavior from potentially concerning behavior. And that's where the sustainability element comes into it. So when we talk about space sustainability options, and Clive mentioned earlier the technology that we have being developed, in-orbit servicing, space traffic management. We have CubeSats out there that are able to measure debris and other satellites to the millimeter. So this is actually changing now the landscape of what technology in the space industry can do. And that's creating frustration or fear from states about what other states can do. And one of the biggest issues we have is a lack of transparency of how we deal with this. So how do we overcome these? And actually, the EU Space Act, I'm not sure if everyone is fully aware, but the EU proposed an act that increases transparency, that essentially now underlines resiliency and sustainability within the security aspect. So any operator or any space player across that value chain is now due to provide concrete data and concrete information about what they're doing, who they're working with across that value chain, what are the security protocols in place now within their missions, and how they're going to ensure security, essentially. And the way they're doing that is through asking about what we call sustainability data. So life cycle assessment data. Where have you got your components from? Have you incorporated a life extension mechanism on your space assets? How can you ensure the cybersecurity element? Will you be at risk of getting hacked? These kind of things. So actually asking the sustainability questions is actually in turn solving, or rather creating, transparency on the security lens. And that's just one example of what we're seeing. So actually, all in all, there are efforts to be made, but what we are seeing is that the conversation about sustainability and security is not necessarily a side conversation anymore. It's just ingrained in everyday conversations, because that is essentially what the industry is dependent on. When, again, if you talk about space debris, if we don't solve that issue, the space industry can't survive. Any potential risk of breakup in the atmosphere will have a profound effect both in the space environment, causing harm to civilian and defense capabilities, but also on Earth as well. So all of these things have come together under the umbrella of space sustainability, but actually what we're really talking about is security and resiliency for the industry and actually for other industries going forward. So stronger emphasis needs to be on that. More discussions need to be on that across nations, because it's not just one nation being affected by this. It's every nation that is potentially at harm or potentially at risk. So having these discussions in the room together, understanding, well, what is actually happening within the industry and how can we contribute to a safe discussion and address those risks, that's what we need to see more of. And we are seeing that to an extent. So I think, again, going back to the Atlas and the objective of the discussion, it provides a good foundation for what are the areas we need to be looking at internationally within our industry. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking our speakers and giving them a round of applause. Thank you, I appreciate it. And now for questions. Please use your microphone and state your name and affiliation to begin with, please.
Alev Mine of the One Goal Initiative for Governance. I understand that norms would include not interfering with an object that would entail higher risk when interfered. This perversely may give an incentive to create objects that have higher risks when interfered, so that one's object would not be interfered with. How do you want to deal with that? Thank you.
Why don't we answer that question first, and then we'll take a couple more. Sabrina, do you want to respond?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and we call it this kind of cycle that we're seeing right now in the industry. And this is, again, why the topic of dual use has come about. How can you essentially have an object that is capable of defending in those situations, but actually you don't frame it as that, it's framed as commercial activity. And if it's needed, you are able to then use it. And that's, again, driving the industry more and more to incorporate these defense capabilities within civilian infrastructure. I'm not going to necessarily give an opinion on whether that's right or wrong. It is what it is. And it's being funded heavily by states. So if we want to backtrack and see how we end this cycle, again, it's up to the states to come together and have that discussion. But at the end of the day, defense priorities are always going to be there. And that's really my 2 cents into that. But I'll pass it over to Clive in case of any further discussion.
Yeah, I guess I don't have too much to add. I suppose in space, there's always this, as things develop, the developments that concern you are also the developments that might give you cause for restraint. And so I guess there are 2 sides of the same coin. So while, you know, a country might be concerned about the proliferation of thousands of satellites and the use of those, you know, in conflict, it also, the large number of objects in space, hopefully, causes states to think, well, you know, I should be cautious about, you know, sort of attacking those satellites. So, yeah, there is yeah, I mean, I don't know that states would be, you know, deliberately kind of use that as a tactic, I guess. I'm not, yeah, I think that's what you were sort of trying to imply. I'm not sure, but yeah, there is that kind of characteristic of space systems, I think.
Thank you very much. I think there was a question over here. 2 questions? Okay, thank you for managing. Thank you for helping. Please, Claudio first and then Andreas.
Thank you, Louis, and thank you for inviting us all for this presentation. I too, like my colleagues before me, found the Atlas extremely interesting and useful, and hopefully it will be as well for other delegations as we prepare for the next part of the OEWG on PAROS in all its aspects. My question has to do with the one element that I found to be slightly thin on the report. I think that the repository of norms that we have there, which derives from the discussions that we had over the years in the GG on TCBMs, the OEWG on space threats, the GG on PAROS, and now the ongoing OEWG on PAROS. It seems to focus on the management of risks of unintended or accidental escalation. I think these are extremely important elements of the discussion on PAROS and should not be overlooked. But I think that a very important element that I see is laterally dealt with in the report is the deliberate creation of risk through the development of potentially destabilizing novel capabilities. This, I think, is an essential element and should be the essential element of our discussions on PAROS and all its aspects. We've seen developments both in the offensive and defensive realm in the past few years and decades that might feed on a arms racing dynamics and making our efforts to manage risk of an unwanted or unwitting kind, even pointless. So I think that it would particularly be interesting to see what the thoughts are on these and on what my perception needs to be one of the focus areas of the OEWG on PAROS, which is to prevent these developments from taking place and rekindling the spirit that we had in the early 60s, in which the international community was able to agree on preventing these developments, such as, for example, by adopting the PTBT in 1963, the Outer Space Treaty and its prohibition of the placement of nuclear weapons and other weapons of mass destruction in orbit in 67. These were not developments that happened because it was easy or easy to prohibit them, or these capabilities were not useful. They were, but they were extremely dangerous and destabilizing. I think that the same approach is sorely needed here. And I would like to hear your thoughts about that and the thoughts of all the panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and I hope you allowed it. I will also say a little bit about the Atlas before posing a question, if that is okay. like Claudia before me, I've been one of the persons who have had the privilege to also be here during the OEWG on responsible behavior, and I think for many delegates or diplomats who have participated in that, it was kind of a revelation that this is a topic that we actually should be concerned with. Mostly also because many of us were not part of the GGEs, not the one that was in the intermediary phase, but also not the previous one. And there has been also a long time since the CD has discussed these topics in our ad hoc group. And as it was pointed out, there has also been a lot of technological development. So when many of us entered this discussion and prepared with the help of civil society and organizations and also good publications like this one, we all came to a very quick and abrupt realization that this is something that actually has a direct impact to our economies, societies, and so on. It has been repeated many times. But this realization was maybe not there in the very long and maybe very dusty discussions that we before. So the idea of the UK to have a new approach and a new lens on the PAROS discussion was very, very valuable. And I think your publication builds on that and looks into the value and the way how norms can achieve the goals of PAROS in general, and also some very, very urgent side goals. And this will also be the main point of my question. When it comes to the report, I see many, I mean, first of all, there's the large number of norms that we are seeing there, which is already very useful. It's kind of a catalog where you can pick and choose. I think what we also really liked is that it goes into detail on some proposals that we have maybe a basic understanding, so it has like certain subsets. I also particularly like that it has positive and negative obligations, so it's not just do not, but also what you can actually actively pursue as a state to help to reduce these risks, which is maybe something we haven't discussed that much in the OEWG, to really look into active steps that we could take collectively. We always liked the implementation of existing treaties. That's hugely important and much undervalued and also under-discussed in the previous OEWG, but also in this one. Very relieved that the proposals do not go into the area of COP wars too much, while we need to invest into each other's ideas. I think what we have done, the analysis that you did, that there is a very specific place for us and specific topics that we can discuss under PAROS, and here I think that's a relief and also something that should spur us into more action. On general, I think there's also maybe scope for a prequel to the text, because we had a lot of interesting and also fun ideas in the ad hoc group in the 90s. I mean, some of them, like transparency agencies, would be extremely useful also in the current context and maybe are going into the same direction. And when it comes to transparency, I mean, this is also something that comes up a lot in COP wars, and here I'm going against what I said before, is sharing of SSA data. And there are a lot of measures in transparency specifically that help in both aspects, in the goals of COP wars, but also in the goals of PAROS. No matter where we take these measures, I mean, there is something that can be achieved also for more transparency and trust when we have more shared data. Brings me back to the previous points. Many of us, many states, smaller states, states of the global south, don't have the possibility to see in space. So they need this kind of additional elements, additional agencies to add or to be able to participate in this transparency. Sorry for being so long. Now, finally coming to my question, I mean, maybe it's directed to Clive, who has also a long history and a lot of experience in these discussions that we are having, especially on norms. I mean, I would be interested how we could maybe also separate these norms in different ways, how they could be useful. For example, those norms who are actually having an immediate effect, who are solving an immediate problem, because I think this has also been an issue that we always dealt with. We have problems that we just have to address right away, and the old approach to PAROS just was not having that kind of speed that we require. So this idea, norms which are having an immediate effect, and maybe then the second category, norms that are building towards something that could be a legal instrument in the future. And then maybe are there also norms which have both effects? Would this kind of classification be useful, and what kind of norms do you see in these two categories or the combined category? Thank you.
Okay, I want to try to see if maybe there's one more question or two more questions that we can squeeze into this, and then we will go one here, and Santiago
at the back, but short questions, please, and we'll try to answer them.
Yes, thank you. I'm Véronique Glaude from the International Telecommunication Union and also the ITU representative to the COPEOS in Vienna. So I follow up somehow with the question from the Austrian colleague about, and to follow up also on what you mentioned about the space sustainability and the interdependency of all those activities. So the activity at ITU, COPEOS, here, PAROS. So we've got different mandates. We do, we tackle this space sustainability from different angles, but somehow we are on the same topic, there's interdependency. And my question is very simple, is maybe on the data sharing aspect. Do you have some ideas or some view of norms that can make all those data shared together, and how?
I would like to begin by expressing my sincere appreciation to the VCDNP, and in particular to Louis, for his work in preparing this document, which I am confident will serve as an essential input in the discussions months to come. I would like also to thank the panelists. My question goes, well, both speakers have highlighted the growing duality between civilian and military usage, which is becoming increasingly evident in these assets. It seems to me that one of the key challenges ahead will be to reach a common understanding of where the line between these two domains lie. From what I understood, this duality appears to stem more from the services that commercial assets provide governments, rather than from the assets themselves. For instance, we see companies capable of providing internet connectivity in conflict zones, which raises important questions regarding the critical capabilities they can offer. So I would like to know from the panelists if they have identified any elements or parameters that could help us better define or delineate this dividing line. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Let's try to answer these quickly because I know that the catering is probably waiting outside. Couple of things I will say very briefly to Claudio's question on is there mostly a risk reduction focus in the publication? We showed what states said. And you will find actually plenty of proposals that are more on the arms control and disarmament side. There's a really interesting sort of spectrum of suggestions that we put in the publication. I can't quite remember what page it is. But in any case, it starts from a norm against DAA-set weapons testing in space all the way to the suggestion that there should be no military equipment whatsoever in space. So there's a whole spectrum of suggestions. Some of them are more focused on risk reduction. Others are focused on disarmament, preventing the deployment of capabilities to space. And it's obviously up to states to work with that and come up with proposals. Andreas, I appreciated your suggestion of norms that could lead to an LBI and norms that have a more immediate effect. I will need to give this more thought. Maybe we'll do a Space Norms Atlas, the Revenge, or something like that, like a part 2. But it's an interesting suggestion. I'll get back to you on that. And to our speakers, please.
Yeah, thank you very much for the questions. First to Claudio's question. So I think you were distinguishing between the kind of deliberate creation of risk and the sort of unintentional creation of risk, and felt the report was focused on the unintentional rather than the intentional, if I've understood correctly. But I guess, you know, to what extent are states trying to create deliberate risk, or is it really the risk is emerging from states trying to develop the capabilities they feel they need to defend themselves or to protect their interests? And when they do develop those capabilities, presumably, you know, they do so taking into account the counter responses and the risks and all these questions. So I'm not sure if like deliberate is the correct way to kind of push it, but I certainly agree with you that all these things need to be discussed, and we look forward to discussing them at the upcoming OEWG. And I suppose, in terms of the report, as Louis said, I mean, it's just a compendium of what states have said. And I think for me, I want to blow the UK trumpet a little bit here, but is that I guess it sort of demonstrates the power of taking innovative approaches to UN processes. If you try to start a conversation that's very broad in nature, then you'll get a lot of different types of ideas coming up, and these are reflected in the report. So I don't think we should be worried about that. I think that's a good thing. On Andreas's question about solving immediate problems and kind of the question is sort of dragging me into possibly previewing UK approach to the OEWG a little bit, but I do think there is potential in both those. I mean, there is an immediate problem to solve in terms of you know, the sort of space debris situation and not making that worse, and so I feel like that should be. And that is one of the topics of discussion in July. So I feel like that's something where we could try to move perhaps more quickly than on other issues where it's a lot more complex and difficult, like rendezvous and proximity operations. Those are happening. That is something that happens in space. But putting the rules around that is a lot more complicated than the sort of the debris issue. So I do see potential to move at different speeds and try and solve issues as they become, you know, if they're amenable to it. And I think when it comes to legally binding instruments, I guess for the UK, you know, it's important for us that anything that we sign up to is that we can be assured that states are going to comply with it, and if they don't comply with it, that can be attributed and detected. And I think there is a possibility, perhaps you could say that you know, with the development of space domain awareness capabilities, you know, there are lots of commercial capabilities on this now that can characterize events in space. And so if a country was to conduct a destructive test of some kind in space, that is potentially detectable and data shareable with a wide range of countries. So I feel like, you know, maybe that could be, you know, that would need more discussion, but, you know, you can see how that might underpin more legally binding options. And why don't I let Samira come in with some questions, and then maybe we'll come to the other ones, later.
Sure. Well, firstly, you have me writing an essay right now in my book. So I just want to very briefly touch on all the questions, just in the interest of time, if that's all right.
Yes, briefly touch on all the questions.
Okay, I will briefly. We can also have a discussion a bit later on. Firstly, regarding the risk question. So space, and maybe I'll go into a bit of the physics here, but space is an environment which we call uncontrolled. The physics, the way it works and so on, there's only so much we can actually control within that. And the spacecraft itself is something where we can maneuver, we can, you know, put on board specific mechanisms to help control the craft. But the difference between the risk of the space environment and maybe what we know on Earth is that we have limited data, and then actually, again, there's so much we can't control. So the Kessler syndrome, for example, is something, I mean, it's a theory out there right now, but that's actually going to damage every infrastructure pretty much. So it's not necessarily, it's only going to damage yours, and we can keep it isolated to a certain nation. So what I'm trying to say is that the risk of the space environment being damaged is a risk to everyone. So intentional damage to the space environment is intentional damage to an individual state's environment as well. So until we can really make that clear, it becomes very hard to then say from a, I would say, a legal perspective, not necessarily legal perspective, but it's hard to then say, this has no risk, this has risk. any damage to any space asset comes with a risk to everyone. And that is one of the drivers why right now space is used on more of the defense side rather than on the war-fighting domain. No one wants to enter the big risk. The second thing that I just wanted to touch on, as it was mentioned earlier, is where the money and where the flow is coming from. So actually space data and space assets and so on, it's invested by public institutions, intergovernmental institutions, VCs, so venture capitalists, private investors, angel investors, you name it. And why I'm saying this is because at no point in the investment process are norms discussed. There's no, do you adhere to certain norms? Are you looking at, say, an example like the Atlas, and are you making sure that throughout your whole process, you are de-risking in that space? That conversation doesn't happen within the flow of the financial criteria and the funding of the industry. The other thing is the industry is actually dominated by private players. NASA don't produce their spacecraft anymore. They then give it to other players to produce or manufacture the spacecraft. Likewise, we see in the European landscape, it's the same thing. So actually, how do you then convince private actors to operate within models that adhere to norms? And this is where I say, make the funding related to the norms, and then you'll see a shift in behavior. You'll see a shift in the way the technology is designed. Then going to the third point about data sharing. So again, I'm going to go back to the financial aspect. Data sharing mechanisms right now mean that anyone who has data or a space operator, you have to pay a lot of money into a specific regime or specific program or initiative, and then together those prestige players that have the funds available can then access the data. The more and more we go in this way, the less we're able to actually have public data available to help all nations around. And this is the biggest issue. It's driven by, again, financial funding, private sector, they have the data, they don't want to share the data unless you pay them for the data. So how do you then create a shared platform? Well, again, I come back to the EU Space Act, where there's an attempt at EU level to actually say, we want you to fill in all this data, share this data, and be transparent and open, because together as the EU, it will then benefit us from a competition perspective. Yeah. And last one, blurred lines, sorry, just to mention there. Again, I mentioned driven by private actors, there's no incentive to unblur the lines. All the incentive is to blur the lines and go more than the dual use aspect. So yeah, I tried to wrap that up quite quickly.
Thank you, Sabrina, and thank you everybody for your patience as we've been working through some tough and big questions. I want to invite you to give another round of applause to our speakers. Thank you very much for coming. On your way out, please take a copy of the Space Norms Atlas. Take one for your colleague, take one for your mom. It makes for a great Easter present. And please help yourselves to some food outside. And thank you again for coming.